What drives men to continue fighting when they know no help is coming? What happens when soldiers hold their position for 5 desperate days, repelling attack after attack, suffering casualties they cannot replace, watching their ammunition dwindle to nothing, only to have their sacrifice erased from the historical record as if it never happened? This is the story of a battle that military historians cannot find in official archives, that appears in no unit citations, and that was deliberately removed from the chronicles of World War II by the very commanders who ordered men to fight it. The battle took place in the winter of 1945, during the final months of the war in Europe. It involved fewer than 200 American soldiers defending a position that their commanders deemed strategically vital. For 5 days and nights, these men fought off repeated German attacks, held their ground against overwhelming odds, and waited for reinforcements that would never arrive. When the battle finally ended, more than half the defenders were dead or wounded. The survivors were scattered to different units, ordered never to speak of what had happened, and the battle itself was classified and buried so deeply that it would take nearly 40 years before the truth began to emerge. This was not a case of military incompetence, though there was plenty of that. It was not a friendly fire disaster, though such incidents had certainly occurred elsewhere. Instead, this was something more insidious, a deliberate decision to sacrifice a small force to conceal a larger strategic failure, followed by an equally deliberate decision to erase any evidence that the sacrifice had occurred. The battle that never officially happened became a ghost in military history, remembered only by the men who fought it and the families who mourned those who did not return. The erasure was systematic and comprehensive. After-action reports were destroyed or falsified. Casualty records were altered to spread deaths across multiple dates and locations, disguising the concentration of losses. Witnesses were threatened with court-martial if they spoke. The conspiracy involved officers at multiple levels of command, from battalion to corps, all united in the common goal of ensuring that their mistakes would never be exposed to public scrutiny. The battle took place in the Hürtgen Forest, a densely wooded region along the German-Belgian border that had already claimed thousands of American lives. By January 1945, the forest had become synonymous with brutal, grinding combat. The tall fir trees grew so closely that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Artillery bursts in the tree canopy sent deadly wooden splinters slicing through the air. Visibility was measured in yards. Every clearing became a killing ground, every trail a potential ambush site. The Hürtgen had been the site of continuous fighting since September 1944. Multiple American divisions had been fed into the forest, each sustaining horrific casualties while gaining minimal ground. The official objective was to reach the Roa River and secure the dams that controlled its flow, preventing the Germans from flooding the river valley and blocking any Allied advance. The unofficial reality was that the Hürtgen had become a matter of institutional pride. American commanders, having committed so many resources to the forest, could not admit that the entire campaign had been a strategic mistake. Military historians would later characterize the Hürtgen Forest campaign as one of the costliest failures in American military history. The terrain heavily favored defenders. The Germans had established prepared positions throughout the forest, with interlocking fields of fire and pre-registered artillery concentrations on every approach route. American advantages in armor and air power were largely negated by the dense vegetation and limited visibility. Yet the attacks continued, driven by commanders who believed that persistence would eventually yield success. By January, the situation had deteriorated further. The German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had drawn away most Allied reserves and disrupted supply lines. Units in the Hürtgen were expected to hold their positions with minimal support while the crisis to the south was addressed. The 78th Infantry Division, which had taken over a sector of the forest in December, was stretched dangerously thin, holding a front of nearly 15 miles with fewer than 10,000 men. The division had been in combat for only a few weeks, but had already learned the terrible lessons of the Hürtgen. Patrols disappeared into the forest and were never seen again. Positions that seemed secure were suddenly overrun by German counterattacks. Artillery fire came without warning, the shells detonating in the trees and sending fragments cascading down on soldiers who thought they were protected in their foxholes. The casualty rate was unsustainable, but reinforcements were scarce, and the orders from higher headquarters remained unchanged. Hold your positions, maintain pressure on the enemy. It was in this context that Captain David Mercer received his orders. Mercer commanded Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, 310th Infantry Regiment. His company had been reduced to 189 men through combat attrition and disease. They were tired, cold, and demoralized after weeks in the forest. On January 12, 1945, Mercer was ordered to take his company to a position designated as Hill 471, establish a defensive perimeter, and hold the position until relieved. Hill 471 was barely a hill at all, just a slight rise in the forest floor. But it overlooked a narrow valley that contained one of the few passable roads through this section of the Hürtgen. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces were massing for a local counterattack, and Hill 471 would be directly in their path. The position was isolated, surrounded by forest, and connected to friendly lines only by a single trail that was often under German observation and fire. Mercer was 32 years old, a pre-war National Guard officer who had been mobilized in 1940. He had led Baker Company since Normandy and had developed a reputation as a careful, competent commander who looked after his men. He questioned the orders immediately. His company was under strength and low on ammunition. The position was exposed and difficult to supply. If the Germans attacked in force, Baker Company would be quickly overwhelmed. His battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes, acknowledged these concerns, but insisted the orders stood. Division headquarters had determined that Hill 471 must be held to prevent German forces from threatening the flank of units farther north. Reinforcements and supplies would be sent as soon as they became available. Hayes was passing along orders he had received from regiment, which had received them from division. At each level, the officers involved had expressed reservations but had ultimately complied. This was the military system working as designed, with subordinates executing orders even when they doubted their wisdom. The problem was that the original order, issued by the division operations officer, had been based on faulty intelligence and flawed analysis. But by the time the order reached Mercer, it had acquired the weight of institutional authority that made questioning it nearly impossible. The men of Baker Company moved into position on the afternoon of January 12th. They found the hill already partially fortified, with foxholes and fighting positions dug by previous occupants. But these defenses were in poor condition, many of them collapsed or filled with frozen mud and snow. The men spent the remaining hours of daylight improving the positions, stringing what little barbed wire they had, and establishing fields of fire in the limited visibility of the dense forest. Among the soldiers digging in on Hill 471 was Sergeant William Patterson, a squad leader who had survived the Normandy landings and fought his way across France. Patterson was 26 years old, a former factory worker from Ohio who had been drafted in 1942. He had developed a sixth sense for trouble, and everything about this position troubled him. The isolation bothered him. The exposure bothered him. Most of all, the vagueness of their orders bothered him. They were told to hold until relieved, but no one could say when relief would come. In his journal, which survived the battle, Patterson wrote, "We're being put in a bad spot. Everyone knows it. But orders are orders, and soldiers go where they're told." Another soldier preparing for what was to come was Private First Class James Kowalski, a replacement who had joined Baker Company in December. Kowalski was 19 years old, from a small town in Pennsylvania, and had been in combat for less than 6 weeks. He had already seen enough to understand that war was nothing like what he had imagined, but he still trusted that his officers knew what they were doing and would not deliberately put him in an impossible situation. That trust would be tested severely in the days ahead. The company's positions formed a rough circle on and around the hill, with the 3 rifle platoons positioned to cover different approaches, and the weapons platoon's machine guns and mortars positioned to provide supporting fire. Mercer established his command post in a particularly deep foxhole near the center of the position, from which he could communicate by radio with his platoon leaders and with battalion headquarters. The radio was an SCR 300, temperamental in the best conditions and notoriously unreliable in the cold and wet of the Hürtgen Forest. The first night passed quietly, which did nothing to ease the tension. German patrols were certainly active in the area, and the silence suggested they were observing, gathering information, preparing. Mercer established a rotating watch schedule, keeping half his men on alert at all times. He positioned his 3 rifle platoons in a triangular defensive perimeter, with his weapons platoon's machine guns covering the most likely avenues of approach. His command post, such as it was, consisted of 2 foxholes covered with logs and camouflage netting. As the men settled into their positions, they conducted the small rituals that soldiers use to prepare for combat. Some wrote letters home, not mentioning where they were or what they were about to face, just sending reassurances that they were fine and thinking of their families. Others cleaned their weapons obsessively, checking and rechecking that everything functioned properly. Some prayed alone or in small groups, asking for protection or simply for the strength to do their duty. A few simply sat in their foxholes, staring into the darkness of the forest, trying to prepare mentally for whatever was coming. Dawn on January 13th brought fog that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. Mercer requested permission to send out patrols to determine if German forces were moving in the area, but this request was denied. Battalion headquarters wanted Baker Company to remain on the defensive, conserving their strength and ammunition. This decision would prove costly. By remaining passive, the Americans gave the Germans time to position forces and prepare their attack without interference. The day passed with ominous silence. The men could hear sounds in the forest, movement, voices speaking German, the clink of equipment, but saw nothing. The fog persisted through the afternoon, a thick grey blanket that muffled sound and distorted perception. By evening, the tension was almost unbearable. The men knew an attack was coming, but not when or from which direction. The waiting was its own form of torture. The German attack began at 5:30 hours on January 14th with a brief but intense artillery barrage. The shells, many of them airburst rounds designed to detonate in the trees, sent fragments and wooden splinters ripping through Baker Company's positions. The barrage lasted only 10 minutes. The Germans were as short on ammunition as the Americans, but it was terrifyingly effective in the confined space of the forest. Men huddled in their foxholes as the world exploded around them. Several positions took direct hits, killing or wounding their occupants before the ground attack even began. When the artillery lifted, German infantry emerged from the fog and forest. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, suggesting they had carefully scouted Baker Company's positions and planned a coordinated assault. The initial wave consisted of perhaps 100 men, advancing in small groups that used the trees for cover and suppressed American positions with automatic weapons fire, while other groups moved forward. The Americans opened fire at close range, sometimes engaging German soldiers at distances of 20 yards or less in the fog and dense vegetation. The firefight was confused and chaotic, with neither side having a clear picture of the overall situation. Individual soldiers fought their own small battles, defending their foxholes against enemy soldiers they could barely see. The noise was overwhelming. Rifles, machine guns, grenades, men shouting orders or screaming in pain. Sergeant Patterson's squad held the southeast corner of the perimeter, where the German attack was strongest. Patterson moved between his men's positions, directing their fire and making sure no one panicked. A German soldier appeared through the fog, less than 10 feet away, rifle raised. Patterson fired first, and the German fell. Another appeared, then another. Patterson's squad was being swarmed, on the verge of being overrun. He called for support from the machine gun positioned 50 yards to his left, but the gun crew was dealing with their own attack and could not shift fire. Private Kowalski, positioned near Patterson, experienced his first full-scale assault. The training he had received, the lessons he had tried to absorb, all of it seemed irrelevant as German soldiers materialized out of the fog. He fired his M1 Garand until the clip ejected with its distinctive ping, reloaded with shaking hands, and fired again. A German grenade landed near his foxhole. Kowalski grabbed it and threw it back, the explosion coming seconds after it left his hand. He did not know if he hit anyone with his rifle fire. In the fog and confusion, he simply pointed his weapon at movement and pulled the trigger. The intensity of the fighting was unlike anything most of the Americans had experienced. The Germans were professionals, veterans of the Eastern Front who knew how to use terrain and coordinate their movements. They threw grenades to suppress American positions, then rushed forward before the defenders could recover. They used machine guns to pin down entire squads, while assault teams maneuvered for better positions. They were aggressive and skilled, and only the Americans' superior firepower kept them from breaking through. The first German assault was repelled after approximately 40 minutes of intense fighting. The attackers withdrew, leaving behind bodies and wounded. Baker Company had held, but at a cost. Mercer's quick count revealed 14 men killed and 23 wounded, reducing his effective strength by nearly 20% in a single engagement. Worse, they had expended a significant amount of ammunition in the defense. If the Germans came again with the same intensity, Baker Company might not have enough bullets to stop them. Mercer radioed his battalion commander, reporting the attack and requesting immediate resupply and medical evacuation for his wounded. The response was not encouraging. No vehicles could reach Hill 471 because the trail was under German observation. A carrying party might be able to get through after dark with ammunition and medical supplies, but evacuation of wounded would not be possible until the tactical situation stabilized. Mercer would have to hold with what he had. The medical situation was particularly dire. Baker Company's senior medic, Corporal Thomas Riley, was one of the few men who could move relatively freely around the position because both sides generally respected medical personnel. Riley worked tirelessly throughout the day, moving from foxhole to foxhole, treating wounded men with the limited supplies he had available. Many of the wounds were serious: arterial bleeding, sucking chest wounds, traumatic amputations from artillery fragments. Riley did what he could, but without proper facilities and supplies, many men who might have survived with prompt evacuation would die on Hill 471. The day continued with sporadic firing and probing attacks. German snipers began engaging any American who showed himself, making movement above ground level suicidal. One of Mercer's platoon leaders, Lieutenant Robert Chen, was killed by sniper fire while moving between positions to check on his men. The company executive officer, First Lieutenant Harold Morrison, took command of Chen's platoon but was wounded less than an hour later by a mortar fragment. The leadership structure was eroding almost as fast as the enlisted ranks. The second major assault came at dusk, when the fading light created shadows and reduced visibility almost as effectively as the morning fog. This time the Germans concentrated their attack on the western side of the perimeter, apparently hoping to break through there and roll up Baker Company's positions. The Americans, warned by the experience of the morning attack, held their fire until the Germans were very close, then unleashed a devastating volley that stopped the assault before it could develop momentum. But ammunition was now a critical concern. Mercer ordered his men to fire only when they had clear targets, to make every shot count. Machine guns were to hold their fire unless a breakthrough seemed imminent. Grenades were to be saved for emergencies. The men complied, but the psychological effect of rationing ammunition was significant. Soldiers felt vulnerable, unsure whether they would have enough bullets if the Germans came again in force. The restriction on ammunition use also meant that the Americans could not maintain suppressive fire that might keep German snipers and mortar teams at bay. The Germans, recognizing that American fire had slackened, became bolder in their movements. They brought mortars closer to American positions, allowing for more accurate fire. They positioned machine guns to enfilade sections of the American perimeter. They were methodically tightening the noose, and Mercer could do nothing to stop it. Night brought no relief. German mortars began firing illumination rounds that turned night into day, preventing the Americans from moving or improving their positions. Under the harsh light of the flares, any movement drew immediate fire. Several men were hit attempting to reach wounded comrades or retrieve ammunition from the dead. The illumination also prevented the promised resupply from reaching Hill 471. The carrying party from battalion turned back after losing 2 men to German fire on the trail. Mercer radioed battalion to report the failure of the resupply attempt and to request artillery support to suppress German mortar positions. He was told that artillery ammunition was being conserved for the defense against the expected German offensive and that Hill 471 could not be supported at this time. The message was clear. Baker Company was on its own. The morning of January 15th found Baker Company exhausted, hungry, and running low on everything necessary to continue fighting. Mercer's situation report to battalion painted a grim picture. Approximately 140 effective soldiers remaining, ammunition down to perhaps 200 rounds per rifle and fewer than 500 rounds per machine gun, no food except what men had in their pockets, and 28 wounded who needed evacuation. The response from battalion was the same: hold the position, help is coming. But Mercer was beginning to understand that help was not coming, that Baker Company had been written off. He did not know why. The strategic importance of Hill 471 was unclear, and the refusal to provide even minimal support suggested that something else was at work. What he did know was that his men were going to die unless something changed. He began to consider options that a few days earlier would have been unthinkable: withdrawal without orders, surrender, some kind of breakout attempt. All of these options were terrible, but they might be less terrible than sitting on Hill 471 waiting to be destroyed. The third day brought the heaviest fighting yet. The Germans, apparently reinforced and determined to take Hill 471, launched multiple assaults throughout the day. Each attack was beaten back, but each cost Baker Company men and precious ammunition. By afternoon, some soldiers were down to fewer than 20 rounds. Machine gunners fired in short, disciplined bursts, making every bullet count. When Germans got close, the Americans fought with bayonets, entrenching tools, and in some cases bare hands. During one of the afternoon assaults, a German soldier managed to get within grenade range of Mercer's command post. The grenade landed between Mercer and his radioman, Private Eugene Walsh. Walsh, without hesitation, threw himself on the grenade. The explosion killed him instantly, but shielded Mercer from the blast. Mercer would carry the guilt of Walsh's sacrifice for the rest of his life, knowing that the young soldier had died to save him, while he led men in a battle that should never have been fought. Sergeant Patterson was wounded during another assault, taking shrapnel in his shoulder and side. He refused evacuation. There was nowhere to evacuate to, and continued directing his squad's defense. His journal entry for that day, written in shaky handwriting, reads, "Third day, still here. Don't know how much longer we can hold. Ammo almost gone. Men are incredible. Nobody talks about giving up. But we need help, and it's not coming." Private Kowalski, now a veteran of 3 days of continuous combat, had lost any illusions about his survival. He wrote a letter to his parents, not expecting to live to send it, trying to explain what he was experiencing and what it meant. The letter, found on his body after the battle and eventually delivered to his family, expressed pride in his unit and confusion about why they had been left to fight alone. He wrote, "We're holding this hill because we were told to. None of us knows why it matters, but we trust Captain Mercer, and we won't let each other down. If I don't make it home, tell everyone I did my duty." The night of January 15, 16 was the worst yet. German forces, frustrated by their inability to dislodge the Americans, brought up additional mortars and subjected Hill 471 to sustained bombardment. The Americans could do nothing but huddle in their foxholes and endure. Several positions took direct hits. The wounded, lying in the open because there was no safe place to put them, suffered additionally from the bombardment. Men prayed, some for deliverance, others simply for the strength to face whatever came next. Corporal Riley, the medic, was killed during the bombardment while attempting to reach a wounded soldier. His death was a severe blow to morale. Riley had been a constant presence, moving fearlessly through the position, offering not just medical care but encouragement and hope. His loss seemed to symbolize that hope was running out. January 16th dawned with a ground attack that began immediately, giving the exhausted Americans no time to recover from the night's bombardment. The Germans had apparently decided that this would be the day they took Hill 471, and they committed forces accordingly. Estimates of German strength varied, but Mercer believed he was facing at least 300 enemy soldiers, possibly more. The assault came from all sides simultaneously, a coordinated effort to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The Germans advanced methodically, using suppressing fire to keep American heads down while assault groups moved forward. They threw grenades into foxholes, poured automatic weapons fire into any position that showed resistance, and pushed relentlessly toward the American lines. Baker Company's situation was desperate. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Machine guns fell silent as gunners ran out of belts. Riflemen fired their last rounds, then picked up weapons from the dead, American and German alike, and continued fighting. The defensive perimeter contracted as positions were abandoned or overrun. Men fell back to secondary positions, then to tertiary positions until the entire company was compressed into an area perhaps 50 yards across. Captain Mercer, fighting alongside his men, made the decision that would define both the battle and its aftermath. He radioed battalion headquarters and reported that his position was being overrun, that his casualties exceeded 50%, and that he was nearly out of ammunition. He requested permission to withdraw what remained of his company back to friendly lines. The response, when it came, was unequivocal. "Hold at all costs. Reinforcements are on the way." But Mercer knew no reinforcements were coming. He had been receiving that same promise for 4 days while watching his men die. He understood, with the clarity that comes from extreme stress, that Baker Company was being deliberately sacrificed. The question was why, and whether there was any way to save his remaining men without disobeying direct orders. The fighting continued through the morning and into the afternoon. The Germans, taking heavy casualties themselves, pulled back to regroup. The lull gave Mercer a chance to assess his situation. He had perhaps 80 men still capable of fighting, though many of them were wounded. Ammunition was almost gone. Some men had fewer than 5 rounds remaining. The defensive position was barely defensible. The wounded numbered close to 50, many of them in critical condition. Mercer gathered his remaining officers and senior NCOs for a council of war. Lieutenant Morrison, despite his wounds, was present. So was Sergeant Patterson, his uniform stiff with dried blood from his own wounds. The consensus was clear. They could not hold through another major assault. The options were to surrender, to withdraw without orders, or to continue fighting until they were killed or captured. Surrender was rejected immediately. The men of Baker Company were not willing to consider it, not after 5 days of fighting. They had held their position, done their duty, and they would not dishonor that sacrifice by giving up now. Withdrawal without orders would be desertion, potentially resulting in court-martial for everyone involved. That left continuing the fight, knowing it was hopeless. It was at this moment that Sergeant Patterson, wounded and exhausted, but still thinking tactically, made a suggestion. What if they did not fight where the Germans expected them to fight? What if they abandoned the hilltop positions that had been the focus of the battle, pulled back into the forest, and conducted a fighting withdrawal toward friendly lines? They would still be defending, technically obeying their orders, but they would be mobile, harder to pin down, and moving towards safety rather than waiting to die. Mercer considered the suggestion carefully. It was technically within the bounds of his orders, which were to hold the position, which could be interpreted as the general area rather than the specific hilltop. It gave his men a chance to survive without requiring them to disobey direct orders. It was also the only option that made any tactical sense. He made his decision. They would hold through the night, then begin a fighting withdrawal at first light. The decision was communicated to the men, and the reaction was mixed. Some felt relief that they would finally be moving, that they would not simply sit and wait for the end. Others felt they were abandoning the ground they had bought with so much blood. But all of them understood that Mercer was trying to save them, and they trusted him enough to follow his lead. The night of January 16-17 brought a strange calm. The Germans, having suffered heavy casualties in the day's fighting, appeared content to wait for morning. They had no reason to believe the Americans would withdraw. Baker Company had held for 4 days, repelling every assault, showing no sign of abandoning their position. The Germans expected that one more attack would finish the job. The Americans used the time to prepare for withdrawal. The wounded who could walk were assembled. Those who could not walk were given what morphine remained and made as comfortable as possible. Mercer faced the agonizing decision of whether to leave the immobile wounded behind or attempt to carry them, knowing that either choice likely meant their deaths. In the end, the wounded made the decision themselves. Those who could not walk insisted that the able-bodied should not risk themselves in futile carrying efforts. They would remain, surrender when the Germans came, and take their chances as prisoners. It was a choice made with dignity and courage, one that haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. Private Daniel O'Brien, who had lost both legs to a German mine, told Mercer, "You get the rest of them out, Captain. We'll be fine. The Krauts have been treating prisoners by the rules. Tell my folks I was brave." As dawn broke on January 17th, the 5th day of the battle, Baker Company began its withdrawal. They moved in small groups, using the dense forest for cover, fighting when they encountered German forces and bypassing them when possible. The Germans, discovering the abandoned hilltop positions, pursued but cautiously, apparently uncertain whether they were walking into an ambush. The withdrawal was a nightmare of exhaustion, fear, and occasional sharp combat. Men carrying wounded comrades struggled through the forest. German fire pursued them, killing several during the retreat. Private Kowalski was hit by sniper fire and killed instantly, dying as he had lived in the previous 5 days. Bravely and without complaint, Sergeant Patterson, despite his wounds, served as rear guard, covering the withdrawal with a handful of volunteers until they were the last ones remaining. Patterson's rear guard action was a desperate fighting retreat, exchanging fire with pursuing Germans while falling back toward friendly lines. 2 of his volunteers were killed, and Patterson himself was hit again, taking a round through his left thigh. But he continued fighting, continued moving, driven by determination not to let his men down. When he finally stumbled through American lines, he collapsed and was immediately evacuated to a field hospital. Of the 189 men who had occupied Hill 471 on January 12th, fewer than 70 reached friendly lines on January 17th. The rest were dead, captured, or missing. Baker Company had ceased to exist as a functional unit. The survivors were immediately dispersed to other companies within the battalion, scattered so thoroughly that they would have difficulty finding each other even if they wanted to. The reception the survivors received was strange and unsettling. Rather than being treated as heroes who had held against overwhelming odds, they were quickly processed, debriefed in cursory fashion, and sent to their new assignments. No one asked for detailed accounts of the fighting. No one seemed interested in how they had held for 5 days, or what lessons might be learned. It was as if the battle had been an embarrassment rather than an accomplishment. The story of what happened next is as disturbing as the battle itself. Captain Mercer, expecting to face questions about his decision to withdraw, was instead met with orders that he was not to discuss the battle with anyone outside his immediate chain of command. His after-action report, carefully documenting the 5 days of combat, was classified immediately. When he asked why, he was told curtly that operational security required it. Within days, the pattern became clear. The survivors of Baker Company were ordered to sign documents stating they would not discuss the battle. They were told that Hill 471 had been part of a classified operation and that revealing any details about it would constitute a breach of security punishable by court-martial. Officers from military intelligence interviewed each survivor individually, making it clear that silence was not optional. The interviews were intimidating by design. Survivors were called one at a time into rooms where 2 or 3 officers questioned them about what they remembered. The officers took notes but discouraged detailed accounts. They were more interested in ensuring that the soldiers understood the consequences of talking than in documenting what had happened. Several survivors reported being told explicitly that discussing the battle could result in charges of revealing classified information, which in wartime could carry the death penalty. Sergeant Patterson, recovering from his wounds in a field hospital, refused to sign the non-disclosure agreement. He argued that soldiers had a right to have their sacrifices acknowledged, that the families of the dead deserved to know how their loved ones had died. His refusal was noted, and he was visited by a senior officer who explained, in terms that left no doubt about the consequences, that Patterson would sign the document or face charges of insubordination in wartime, a capital offense. The officer who delivered this threat was a colonel from division headquarters, a staff officer who had never been to Hill 471 and had no understanding of what Patterson and his comrades had endured. But he had authority, and he made clear that he would use it. Patterson, understanding that resistance was futile and might prevent the truth from ever being told, signed the document. But he also began keeping detailed records of everything he could remember about the battle. He hid these records in his personal effects, intending to reveal them after the war, when the threat of court-martial no longer applied. Patterson's hidden records included not just his own recollections, but also information from other survivors he managed to contact. He documented the dates of the battle, the positions of each platoon, the names of men killed and wounded, the number of German attacks repelled. He recorded Mercer's requests for support and the responses he received. It was a comprehensive account, compiled at great personal risk, motivated by Patterson's conviction that the truth mattered more than regulations. The reason for the cover-up gradually became apparent to some of the survivors, though the full story would not emerge for decades. Hill 471 had never been strategically important. The intelligence reports suggesting German forces were massing for an attack had been misinterpreted or simply wrong. Baker Company had been sent to defend the hill not because it needed defending, but because division headquarters had made a significant error in their deployment of forces, leaving a gap in their lines that could have been exploited by the Germans. The deployment error was the result of multiple factors. A staff officer had misread a map and placed a battalion in the wrong sector. When the error was discovered, rather than repositioning the battalion, which would have required admitting the mistake and disrupting operational plans, division headquarters decided to leave one company in an exposed position as a screen while quietly correcting the deployment. The expectation was that German forces, weakened by months of attrition, would not be capable of sustained attacks, and that Baker Company could hold for the day or two needed to properly position forces. This expectation proved catastrophically wrong. The German forces facing Hill 471 were stronger than intelligence had assessed, motivated by defending their homeland and quite capable of sustained operations. When they attacked in force, Baker Company was left to fight alone, not because reinforcing them was impossible, but because doing so would reveal the deployment error that senior officers were trying to hide. Rather than admit this error and reposition forces to close the gap, senior officers had decided to place a single company in an exposed position, hoping their presence would deter any German probes and buying time to correct the deployment error. When the Germans did attack, rather than reinforcing Baker Company or allowing them to withdraw, headquarters had continued to insist they hold, because admitting the position was untenable would be admitting the entire deployment had been flawed. In essence, nearly 200 men had been sacrificed to cover up a planning mistake. When the scale of the disaster became apparent, half the company killed or captured defending a position that had no real value, the decision was made to classify the entire operation. If the battle never officially happened, then no one could be held accountable for the decisions that led to such catastrophic losses. The families of the dead received telegrams stating their loved ones had been killed in action in the Hürtgen Forest, with no additional details. The families of those captured received similar notifications stating their loved ones were prisoners of war. No mention was made of Hill 471 or Baker Company's stand. When family members wrote seeking more information, they received formulaic responses citing operational security and the impossibility of providing details about specific combat actions during ongoing operations. Captain Mercer, consumed by guilt over the men he had lost and rage at the command decisions that had doomed them, submitted a detailed report through proper channels, requesting a formal investigation into the decision to place Baker Company on Hill 471 and the subsequent refusal to provide support. His report was comprehensive, documenting not just the battle, but the requests he had made for support and the responses he had received. It was a clear indictment of division-level decision-making. His report disappeared into the military bureaucracy. When he followed up 2 weeks later, he was told that no such report existed in the files. Mercer assumed this was an administrative error and submitted a second report, attaching copies of the radio logs that documented his communications with battalion. This report also disappeared. When he attempted to submit a third report, he was called into his commander's office and told in explicit terms that continuing to raise the issue would end his military career and possibly result in charges. The officer who delivered this warning was Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, Mercer's battalion commander, who was himself implicated in the disaster. Hayes had passed along the orders to occupy Hill 471, had promised support that never materialized, and had urged Mercer to hold even when the situation became hopeless. Hayes was protecting himself as much as he was protecting the division staff, and he made clear that Mercer's persistence was threatening everyone involved. Mercer, like the enlisted men, had no choice but to comply, but he also kept his own records, his own account of what had happened. He saved copies of his reports, radio logs, and casualty lists. He corresponded secretly with some of the survivors, gathering their testimonies and building a comprehensive file that he intended to make public after the war. The file documented not just what happened, but why it happened and who was responsible. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The survivors of Hill 471, scattered across various units, returned home with their secrets intact. They had been threatened with prosecution if they spoke about the battle, and most believed those threats were real. They went back to their civilian lives, carrying the weight of what they had experienced and their inability to share it with anyone who had not been there. Some survivors tried to connect with each other, seeking out fellow veterans of Baker Company. They would meet quietly at VFW halls or private homes, speaking in vague terms about their shared experience, careful not to violate the orders they had been given. These informal gatherings provided some comfort, a reminder that they were not alone in carrying this burden, but they could not openly acknowledge what they had been through or honor the men who had died. These gatherings were themselves risky. Several survivors reported being visited by military investigators who asked questions about whom they were meeting and what they were discussing. The message was clear. Even in peacetime, even after the war had ended, the military was monitoring the Hill 471 survivors and ensuring their silence. This surveillance continued for years, gradually diminishing but never entirely stopping, a constant reminder that speaking the truth carried risks. The suppression of the Battle of Hill 471, as it came to be known among the handful of people aware of its existence, represented a profound institutional failure. The decision to sacrifice Baker Company to cover up a planning error was bad enough. The decision to then erase the battle from history compounded the original sin, denying the dead any recognition and the survivors any acknowledgement of what they had endured. The military justification for classification was that revealing the battle would expose weaknesses in American command and control that could be exploited by enemies. This argument had some validity during the war, when the Germans might have used such information for propaganda or tactical advantage. But the classification remained in effect long after the war ended, long after Germany was defeated and occupied, long after any conceivable military justification had expired. The real reason for continued classification was institutional embarrassment. Senior officers who had made the decisions that led to the disaster went on to distinguished post-war careers. Several reached flag rank, commanding divisions and corps during the Korean War and the Cold War. Revealing the truth about Hill 471 would have damaged their reputations and called into question their fitness for command. The institutional military, protective of its senior leaders, chose to maintain the cover-up rather than acknowledge the failure and hold anyone accountable. The division operations officer, who had made the initial deployment error that necessitated placing Baker Company on Hill 471, retired as a major general. The division commander, who had approved the decision to leave Baker Company unsupported, became a corps commander and retired with full honors. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, who had passed along impossible orders and promised support he could not deliver, commanded a regiment in Korea and was decorated for his service. None of them ever faced any consequences for their roles in the Hill 471 disaster. This decision had profound effects on the survivors. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress, unable to seek proper treatment because they could not explain what had traumatized them without violating their non-disclosure agreements. The inability to speak about their experiences meant they could not access the emerging understanding of combat trauma that was beginning to develop in the post-war period. They were left to cope on their own with nightmares, anxiety, depression, and survivor guilt. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to manage their symptoms. Several were arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct or domestic violence, their untreated trauma manifesting in destructive behaviors. Some lost jobs, marriages, and relationships because they could not explain the demons they were fighting. A few committed suicide, leaving families bewildered about what had driven them to such despair. The families of these men often never understood what had driven them to such actions, because the survivors could not share the source of their pain. The families of the dead were denied closure. They knew their loved ones had died in the Hürtgen Forest, but they did not know the circumstances. They could not know that their sons and husbands had fought with extraordinary courage for 5 days, had held their position against overwhelming odds, had died not in some confused skirmish, but in a deliberate, sustained defense that deserved recognition. This knowledge might have provided some measure of comfort, some sense that the deaths had meaning. Instead, families were left with uncertainty and unanswered questions that would never be answered. Eleanor Kowalski, James's mother, wrote hundreds of letters over the years, seeking information about how her son had died. She wrote to the army, to her congressman, to veterans organizations, to anyone she thought might be able to provide answers. She received polite but uninformative responses that offered sympathy but no details. She died in 1971, 26 years after her son's death, never knowing that he had fought heroically for 5 days on Hill 471, never knowing that his sacrifice had been deliberately hidden from her. Captain David Mercer returned to civilian life and became a lawyer. He maintained his file on Hill 471, adding to it whenever he encountered new information or connected with another survivor. He wrote letters to military historians, to journalists, to members of Congress, trying to bring attention to the battle and the cover-up. Most ignored him, dismissing him as another bitter veteran with an axe to grind. A few investigated, but were unable to penetrate the classification that protected the records. One journalist, Martin Crawford of the Washington Post, took Mercer's story seriously enough to conduct a preliminary investigation in 1963. Crawford contacted the Pentagon seeking comment and requesting access to records from the 78th Infantry Division's operations in January 1945. He was told that many records from that period had been lost or destroyed, and that the specific operation he was asking about could not be confirmed or denied. Without documentary evidence, Crawford could not publish the story, and his investigation stalled. Mercer died in 1973, having never succeeded in his mission to reveal the truth. His widow, following his wishes, preserved his file and continued trying to find someone who would tell the story. She contacted historians, journalists, and authors, offering access to her husband's meticulously compiled records. Most were skeptical, unwilling to challenge the official historical record without corroborating evidence from military archives. Sergeant William Patterson survived the war and returned to his pre-war job as a teacher. He kept his journal and his notes about Hill 471 hidden in his home, telling only his wife about them. He made her promise that if he died, she would try to find someone who could tell the story. He suffered from nightmares and depression, but sought no treatment, fearing that any psychiatric evaluation might lead to questions about his wartime experiences that he could not answer without risking prosecution. Patterson taught high school history for 30 years, educating students about World War II while unable to share his own experiences from the war. The irony was not lost on him. He wrote in a private letter to another survivor, "I teach about the Bulge, about Market Garden, about D-Day. My students think I'm an expert on the war, but the one battle I really know, the one I lived through, I can't mention. I teach a sanitized version of history, leaving out the parts that would make it real." The breakthrough came in 1982, 37 years after the battle. A military historian named Dr. Robert Chambers was researching the Hürtgen Forest campaign and came across a brief reference in a personnel file to Baker Company, 310th Infantry Regiment, being detached for special operations in January 1945. Intrigued by this cryptic notation, Chambers began searching for more information about what these special operations might have been. His search led him through multiple archives and hundreds of hours of document review. He found oblique references to Hill 471 in reports that had escaped classification. He discovered that casualty records for Baker Company showed an unusual concentration of losses in mid-January 1945, though the records attributed these losses to different dates and locations. The pattern suggested that something significant had been systematically obscured. Chambers eventually tracked down 5 survivors of Hill 471 who were willing to speak with him on the condition of anonymity. Their accounts, which corroborated each other in remarkable detail, painted the picture of the 5-day battle. They told Chambers about Captain Mercer's file and suggested he contact Mercer's widow, who might still have it. They also mentioned Sergeant Patterson's records, though Patterson had died 2 years earlier. Mercer's widow did indeed have the file, which she had kept hidden for nearly a decade since her husband's death. She provided it to Chambers with the request that he tell the story her husband had been prevented from telling. The file contained Mercer's reports, letters from survivors, casualty lists with notations about how each man had died, radio logs documenting the requests for support and the responses received, and Mercer's own narrative of the battle written years after the events. Patterson's widow was also contacted and provided her husband's journal and notes. These documents, compiled by a man with no formal historical training, but with keen powers of observation and detailed memory, filled in gaps in Mercer's account and provided the perspective of an enlisted man who had experienced the battle from the front lines rather than the command post. Chambers spent 2 years corroborating the information in these files, tracking down additional survivors and attempting to access official records. The records remained classified, but he was able to piece together enough information from other sources to confirm the basic facts of the battle. In 1984, he published an article in a military history journal detailing what he had discovered about Hill 471 and the subsequent cover-up. The article created a sensation among military historians, but initially received little attention from mainstream media. The Pentagon, when asked to comment, stated that they could neither confirm nor deny the existence of classified operations from World War II, and that revealing such information, if it existed, could compromise sources and methods that remained relevant to national security. This response was transparently absurd. No sources or methods from 1945 could possibly be relevant 40 years later, but it provided bureaucratic cover for continuing the classification. The story gained wider attention when several major newspapers picked it up. The Washington Post, remembering Martin Crawford's earlier investigation, assigned a reporter to follow up on Chambers' findings. The New York Times ran a front-page story about the battle that had been deleted from history. Television news programs interviewed survivors who were now willing to speak publicly, having decided that they had been silent long enough and were no longer afraid of prosecution. The revelation prompted Congress to request that the Pentagon declassify records related to Hill 471. After initial resistance, military officials agreed to review the classification of relevant documents. The review took nearly 3 years, with the Pentagon declassifying some records while maintaining classification on others for reasons that were never clearly explained. The released documents confirmed the essential accuracy of Chambers' account and the survivors' testimonies. What the documents also revealed was the extent of the cover-up. After-action reports had been falsified to spread Baker Company's casualties across multiple dates and locations, disguising the fact that they had all occurred in a single, sustained battle. Letters from Captain Mercer requesting an investigation had been deliberately buried with notations indicating they were to be filed without action. Orders had been issued to scatter survivors to prevent them from comparing notes and maintaining unit cohesion that might lead to collective resistance to the cover-up. The documents showed that the cover-up had been systematic and had involved officers at multiple levels of command. The Division Chief of Staff had personally reviewed the plan to disperse survivors and classify records. The Corps commander had been briefed on the situation and had approved the classification. Even officers at Army-level headquarters had been aware that a company had been sacrificed and that the incident was being suppressed to protect senior officers from accountability. The families of the men who had fought on Hill 471 reacted to these revelations with a mixture of vindication, anger, and renewed grief. Many had suspected that they had not been told the full truth about how their loved ones had died, but they had assumed this was simply a matter of wartime secrecy that would eventually be revealed. Learning that the secrecy had been maintained for nearly 40 years, not for security reasons, but to protect the reputations of officers who had made fatal mistakes, was a betrayal that reopened old wounds. Eleanor Kowalski had died 13 years before the truth emerged, having spent 26 years seeking answers that were deliberately withheld from her. Her daughter, Catherine Kowalski Harris, gave an interview after the story broke, speaking of her mother's lifelong quest for information and how learning the truth decades too late felt like a final insult added to the original injury of her brother's death. The Pentagon, facing public and congressional pressure, agreed to conduct a review of the Hill 471 battle and the subsequent cover-up. The review, completed in 1987, acknowledged that Baker Company had been placed in an untenable position due to a deployment error, that the strategic value of Hill 471 had been negligible, and that the classification of records after the battle had been excessive and unjustified. However, the review stopped short of assigning specific blame to any individual officers, noting that most of those involved were deceased and that judging their decisions with hindsight was unfair. This conclusion satisfied almost no one. The survivors felt that acknowledging the injustice without assigning responsibility was meaningless, a bureaucratic exercise designed to appear responsive while avoiding any real accountability. Military reformers argued that the failure to hold anyone accountable, even posthumously, perpetuated a culture where commanders could make fatal mistakes without consequences. Historians noted that the incomplete declassification meant that significant aspects of the story remained hidden, preventing a full understanding of what had happened and why. The surviving veterans of Hill 471 were finally free to speak openly about their experience after more than 40 years of enforced silence. Several gave interviews or wrote memoirs, providing detailed accounts of the 5 days of fighting. They described the progressive deterioration of their situation, the sense of abandonment as promised reinforcements never arrived, and the bitter knowledge that their sacrifice had been deemed too embarrassing to acknowledge. Most emphasized that they did not consider themselves heroes. They had simply done what they were ordered to do, but they wanted the men who had died to be properly remembered and honored. A group of survivors and family members campaigned for official recognition of the battle and for appropriate honors for those who had fought there. They requested that Hill 471 be designated as a significant battle site, that the men who fought there receive appropriate medals and citations, and that the battle be included in official histories of the Hürtgen Forest campaign and World War II. Some of these requests were granted. Several soldiers received posthumous decorations, including bronze and silver stars, and the battle was acknowledged in updated official histories. But the formal recognition came 4 decades too late for most of the men who had earned it, and for many of the families who deserved to know the truth. The Battle of Hill 471 stands as one of the most shameful episodes in American military history, not because of how the battle was fought, but because of how it was hidden. The soldiers of Baker Company fought with extraordinary courage and determination, holding their position against overwhelming odds for 5 days, waiting for help that never came. When they finally withdrew, it was in good order, still fighting, having accomplished everything that could reasonably have been expected of them and more. Their commanders failed them utterly, failed them by placing them in an exposed position to cover up a deployment error, rather than admitting a mistake and correcting it promptly, failed them by refusing to reinforce or withdraw them, even as the situation became hopeless, prioritizing the protection of reputations over the lives of soldiers, failed them most profoundly by erasing their sacrifice from history to avoid accountability, denying them and their families the recognition they deserved. The institutional military, protective of its image and its senior leaders, chose bureaucratic self-interest over honesty and over the honor of men who had served faithfully and well. The survivors carried the burden of this betrayal for decades. They could not speak of what they had experienced, could not honor their dead comrades publicly, could not seek recognition for what they had endured. The enforced silence compounded their trauma, making it impossible to process their experiences in healthy ways. Some were broken by this enforced silence, their lives damaged or destroyed by untreated trauma that they could not explain without violating orders. Others found ways to cope, drawing strength from private connections with fellow survivors or from their own sense of having done their duty, regardless of recognition. Sergeant William Patterson lived until 1995, long enough to see the battle finally acknowledged and to give his own account of events to historians and journalists. In one of his last interviews, conducted when he was 76 years old and visibly failing, he reflected on the 50 years that had passed since Hill 471. "We knew we were being sacrificed. We knew no one was coming to help us, but we fought anyway, because that's what soldiers do. We held that position because we were ordered to, and we trusted that there was a good reason even when we couldn't see it. What hurt was not the fighting or the dying, it was the lying afterward, the pretending it never happened, the denial of what we had been through. They could have at least given us the truth." Patterson died 3 months after that interview, taking with him the last clear memories of men who had fought alongside him on Hill 471. At his funeral, several other survivors attended, old men now, some in wheelchairs, bearing the physical and psychological scars of a battle that had not officially existed for most of their lives. They did not speak much, but their presence together was a silent acknowledgement of shared experience that transcended official denial. Captain David Mercer, who did not live to see the vindication he sought, left behind a statement to be opened after the battle was finally acknowledged. The statement, written in 1972, a year before his death from heart disease that his doctors believed was stress-related, reflected both his pride in his men and his anger at the system that had betrayed them. "I failed my men by not refusing the orders that sent them to Hill 471. I should have known those orders would get them killed for no good reason, and I should have had the courage to say no. But having sent them, having watched them fight and die with a courage I can barely comprehend, I could not allow their sacrifice to be erased as if it meant nothing. This record exists so that someone, someday, will know what they did and what it cost them. They held that position for 5 days against overwhelming odds. They deserved better than to be forgotten, and I hope that this record will ensure they are finally remembered as the brave soldiers they were." The families who learned the truth decades after their loved ones died expressed a range of emotions, from relief at finally knowing to anger at having been deceived for so long. Eleanor Kowalski's daughter, Catherine, spoke for many when she said at a memorial service in 1987, "My mother spent 26 years trying to learn how my brother died. She wrote hundreds of letters, talked to anyone who might know, never gave up hoping for answers. She died never knowing that he had fought heroically for 5 days, that he had written her a letter expressing his pride in his unit and his determination to do his duty. She deserved to know that. We all deserve to know that. The military took that from us, and no apology can give it back." James Kowalski's letter, the one found on his body after the battle, was finally delivered to his family in 1985, 40 years after his death. Reading her brother's words after so long, Catherine said, was like hearing his voice again, but it also reopened the wound of his loss and added the new wound of understanding how long the truth had been hidden from them. The letter is now in the collection of the National World War II Museum, where it serves as a reminder of the human cost of institutional cover-ups. The military's institutional response to the Hill 471 revelations was inadequate and revealed the persistence of the cultural problems that had led to the cover-up in the first place. The acknowledgement that the cover-up had been wrong was not accompanied by any systemic reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. The classification system that had enabled the cover-up remained essentially unchanged, with the same potential for abuse. The command culture that prioritized reputation over accountability continued largely intact. The lessons that might have been learned from Hill 471 were never fully absorbed by the institution. This failure to learn is perhaps the most damning aspect of the entire episode. The men of Baker Company died defending a position of no strategic value because their commanders made mistakes and were too proud to admit them. Their sacrifice was then hidden because acknowledging it would have been embarrassing to senior officers whose careers might have been damaged. And when the truth finally emerged 4 decades later, the military establishment's response was to express regret while changing nothing fundamental about how it operated or held leaders accountable. Modern military operations still involve the potential for soldiers to be placed in impossible situations by flawed command decisions. The mechanisms for accountability remain inadequate, with senior officers rarely facing serious consequences for mistakes that cost lives. The institutional bias toward protecting senior leadership over acknowledging mistakes persists, manifesting in everything from after-action reports that obscure failures to classification of embarrassing incidents. Hill 471 was supposed to be a cautionary tale, but the caution was never seriously heeded by the institution it should have reformed. The survivors of Hill 471, those few who remained alive when the story became public, formed a small association to preserve the memory of the battle and advocate for the men who fought it. They held annual reunions at a VFW hall in Ohio, the gatherings dwindling in number each year as age and illness took their toll. They spoke to students and historians when invited, ensuring that the story would not be lost again now that it could finally be told openly. They raised funds to erect a memorial at the site of Hill 471, traveling to Germany in 1989 to dedicate a simple stone marker bearing the names of the men who died there. The memorial dedication was attended by several dozen people, surviving veterans, family members, historians, and a few German citizens from the nearby village who came out of respect for soldiers who had fought on their land. No official military representatives attended, though the survivors had invited the Secretary of Defense and the Chief of Staff of the Army. The absence of official representation was noted by all present and understood as a continuation of the military's discomfort with acknowledging the Hill 471 disaster. The last surviving veteran of Hill 471, Raymond Chen, brother of Lieutenant Robert Chen, who had been killed by sniper fire on the second day, died in 2008 at the age of 84. Raymond had been a private in his brother's platoon and had witnessed Robert's death. He carried guilt about surviving when his older brother had not, a burden made heavier by the decades of enforced silence about how and why Robert had died. His obituary, published in his hometown newspaper, mentioned that he had fought in the Hürtgen Forest and survived 5 days of intense combat that had been suppressed for decades. With his death, the living memory of Hill 471 passed into history, preserved now only in the accounts the survivors left behind and in the records that were finally declassified. The battle that was deleted from history has been restored to its proper place in the historical record, but the restoration came too late for most of those who fought it. They died without recognition, without acknowledgement, their service reduced to a classified footnote that most people would never read. Their families grieved without fully understanding what they were grieving for, denied the comfort that might have come from knowing their loved ones had fought with extraordinary courage. The injustice of this cannot be remedied by posthumous recognition, though such recognition is better than none and represents at least some acknowledgement of what was done to these men. The deeper lesson of Hill 471 is about institutional integrity and the cost of its absence. When military institutions prioritize their image over truth, when they protect reputations rather than acknowledge failures, when they classify embarrassment as if it were a national security secret, they betray the soldiers who serve them and the society they claim to protect. The men of Baker Company served faithfully and fought courageously under impossible conditions. They deserved better than to be sacrificed for a mistake and then erased to cover up that mistake. They deserved honesty, recognition, and the accountability that might have prevented future soldiers from facing similar betrayals. Every military organization faces the temptation to hide its failures, to protect its leadership, to maintain a public image of competence even when internal reality suggests otherwise. Hill 471 demonstrates the moral bankruptcy of yielding to that temptation and the long-term costs of prioritizing institutional self-interest over truth. The soldiers who died deserve to have their sacrifice acknowledged. The survivors deserve to have their service recognized. The families deserve to know the truth. All of these people were denied what they deserved because institutional self-interest was valued more highly than honesty, because protecting careers was deemed more important than honoring service. The story of Hill 471 is ultimately a story about the men who fought there and the courage they displayed in impossible circumstances. Private Kowalski, writing his final letter. Sergeant Patterson, wounded but still fighting, still leading. Captain Mercer, trying desperately to save his men while obeying orders that made salvation impossible. Private Walsh, throwing himself on a grenade to save his commander. Corporal Riley, the medic killed while trying to reach a wounded man. Lieutenant Chen, shot by a sniper while checking on his soldiers. All of these men and scores of others whose names are recorded on a memorial marker in a German forest that few people visit. But it is also a story about institutional failure, about the corruption that occurs when accountability is abandoned, and about the long-term costs of short-term cover-ups. The battle was deleted from history by men who valued their reputations more than truth, who chose silence over acknowledgement, who believed that erasing evidence of failure was preferable to learning from it. The truth eventually emerged, but it took nearly 40 years, and by then most of those who deserved to know it were dead. They fought for 5 days without reinforcements. They held their position until holding it was impossible, then withdrew in good order, still fighting, still soldiers worthy of the name. And then, for 37 years, they were told that none of it had happened, that their sacrifice did not exist, that their dead comrades were casualties of routine operations rather than victims of decisions made by commanders who valued careers over lives. The restoration of their story to history is a small justice, late and incomplete, but it matters. It matters because the men who fought on Hill 471 mattered. It matters because truth matters, even when it is inconvenient or embarrassing. It matters because the alternative, allowing institutions to erase whatever they find uncomfortable, is intolerable in any society that claims to value honor and integrity. The Battle of Hill 471 is no longer deleted from history. The men who fought there are remembered. Their story is told. That is not enough to make things right, but it is something, and it serves as a warning that the cost of institutional dishonesty is measured in betrayed soldiers, grieving families, and corroded trust that, once lost, may never be fully regained.